We're here today to hear from Dr. Rollins. He holds a BS in biology from the University of Houston, an MA in Pan-African Studies from the University of Louisville, a PhD in medical sociology from the University of California, San Francisco. And he is currently an assistant professor in the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. He's had previous positions at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Louisville, as well as doing a recent stint as a visiting researcher in residence at the Brosher Foundation in Switzerland. So as I mentioned before, Dr. Rollins is an interdisciplinary researcher, but if you're looking to put a kind of a core label on him, his faculty page anyway describes him as a qualitative sociologist. So his work examines issues of race and racism, both in science and technology and using science and technology as a method of investigation. So his 2021 book, Conviction, The Making and Unmaking of the Violent Brain, examines persistent biological essentialism and determinism in science and society by tracing the development and use of neuroimaging research on antisocial behaviors and crime. I first became aware of his work through a piece he published in Nature Human Behavior on the topic that I believe he'll be speaking about today, as well as a viewpoint piece in Cortex, which if you don't think that neuroscience has a problem, you should just read the editor's reply to that viewpoint, and you'll appreciate the scope of the issues confronting us. Looking forward, Dr. Rollins's current projects focus on the social implications and challenges of operationalizing racial prejudice, implicit bias, and identity as neurobiological processes, and the politics of social justice and neuroscience, which aims to elucidate the sociopolitical vulnerabilities and anti-racist promises for contemporary neuroscientific practices. So please join me in welcoming Oliver Rollins.
So I want to kind of start with a little disclaimer. So this is not a usual, I guess, research talk. So like I've just finished my book and I'm kind of in that position where I'm like transitioning to new projects. And so part of this is kind of my thinking, both reflecting back on what I got out of the book and where I'm trying to go with these next projects. And hopefully this makes sense and we can have some conversation about kind of like what I'm trying to get at when I talk about towards an anti-racist neuroscience. So the title of my talk is Towards an Anti-Racist Neuroscience, and I purposely say towards because I want us to kind of think about the idea of, you know, anti-racism, social justice, not as this end goal to use. I'm a football fan, so to use like a football analogy, end goal where we get to the end zone and we get to spike the ball and we say it's over, we scored, we won the game, but more or less as a constant struggle, right? And so what actually makes, I think, these things really hard to kind of understand about, I guess, how you implement these things is that they don't necessarily fit into the metrics that we use within the institution to kind of understand how you make change, right? Because it's kind of a constant change. So like when we bring in programs, when we do these things, these are not things that we have like pilots on. These are things that we actually say need to be part of the kind of institutional fabric of a university, right? These things need to stay around, right, in a way. And so that means like as you're working toward anti-racism or social justice, it's something that we'll constantly kind of struggle with. We not always get right, but that we are moving towards something. And partly, I think the question I'm asking is, you know, what is it that we're moving toward? Right, when we say we want anti-racism or anti-racist science or social justice science, social justice society, what is that vision and what are we looking forward and what would that look like for neuroscience is kind of the questions I want us to kind of think about in my talk. And then the second part of my talk is like to think about the possibilities and problematics of scientific progress. So partly the way I'm kind of trying to think through this question is to understand how we use these narratives of progress, both in the social sense of like what is social progress, but also scientific progress. And I argue that there's some problems with us always kind of using that progress, this kind of linear way of thinking about progressing in ways that may actually miss opportunities for us to really get at how to deal with anti-racism or how to deal with social justice or these systemic inequalities. So scholars have long been critical of narratives that convey a natural progression of scientific inquiry or society, right? This kind of idea of social progress. Rejecting the idea that scientific progress is linear, objective, and or a natural process. Many of these scholars who come out of science technology studies, sociology, anthropology, and other places, right, make clear that the production of scientific knowledge is a human or social practice, and that scientific progress is neither a straightforward accumulation of knowledge, nor an obvious development of thought, right? My entry into this kind of idea of thinking about progress starts somewhere else, right? For this afternoon, I want to kind of talk about my entry of thinking about this, not from science technology studies or philosophy, but starting with scholar W. Du Bois, who maybe we can also call a philosopher in a way, but starting with Du Bois, right? And Du Bois kind of understanding, right? And I want to point this out for a few reasons. One is because this year is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and thus the 50th anniversary of Du Bois's death. Du Bois died on the morning of the March on Washington in 1963. This is also, we're in Atlanta, where much of Du Bois's work comes out. This is where like the start of kind of American sociology comes out of Atlanta University with Du Bois. And this is also in my book, which I write in my preface, where I actually begin to kind of think about this question and problematize this question, really doing that kind of interdisciplinary work around what is progress and how we think about these notions of progress, right? So reading Du Bois, for me, it became clear that progress is an antiquated, crude, or normalizing paradigm. And adherence to this kind of reading of progress leaves us woefully unprepared to capture either the incessant function of racial relations or the politics of scientific knowledge and technologies, right? So Du Bois, in his 1903 seminal text, The Souls of Black Folks, would say or would call that text a way of capturing the sobering realization of the meaning and I would say limits of progress, right? So what Du Bois set out to do is to think about what are these narratives of progress actually supposed to mean? The real question he asked was, what do you do with this newly freed population of Black enslaved folks now that we no longer have enslavement, but they are now quote unquote citizens, right? So what does it even mean to be a citizen? What does it even mean to have progress, racial progress within our society, right? That's what he sought out to kind of answer in The Souls of Black Folk, right? And so from that, right, really studying and thinking about that, right, I started to think that like, you know, in part, what we call progress, right, does not always bend toward that arc of the arc of like a moral universe or towards social justice or reason or truth or all of these things. In fact, many times the way in which we have used these notions of progress are ways that have kind of reconceptualized or reconstituted power dynamics, right? And so what this means is that we can learn something from a potentially different kind of understanding of the historical and contemporary moments in which we use these notions around progress, right? And this is kind of what I'm trying to kind of tease out in part here, right? And so I have more or less, I think, 3 case studies that I kind of want to think through to kind of say, like, here's where I think there's some problematic with progress and tying back this question of race, right? So first, case 1 is kind of thinking about the Enlightenment era progress. Obviously, right, since the Enlightenment era, we've been told or sought to uphold this idea that science is objective, rational, transformative, all of these things, right? This is kind of something we build into our science today. The very term scientific advancement, which is often used in an axiomatic manner to describe all accepted scientific data, technology, and knowledge, aptly kind of captures this point. The production of scientific knowledge, we are told, will inevitably improve society. We recite this in and out of the academy. Thus, science is progress in a sense, right? We automatically believe that when we are producing science, we are producing progress, right? One of the arguments I want to make is that we also automatically believe within society that the more we've moved through society, the better things have gotten, right? That the better racial relations have gotten. I think there's examples of this more contemporary where we say, have we actually stepped back and went into the past where it doesn't seem like things are getting better? But to me, that actually opens up a space to say that the narratives of progress have also been problematic, that we have been missing points that we are supposedly moving towards something better. Right. And as we see here in these illustrations from the 18th century naturalist and Enlightenment thinker, Johann Blumenbach, right, there was always inherent cautions to these notions of scientific progress. So obviously the Enlightenment era was about moving the world forward, right, really moving thinking forward, really away from religion. Also, although we see that much of Enlightenment thinking was actually more entwined with what kind of religious thinking than it was a separation, right? And so in Blumenbach's 5 racial varieties, which were based on differences in physical characteristics of humans, he framed as being caused by things like diet and climate, right? So one thing is that very early thinking like Blumenbach was not the kind of scientific racism that we think about within the 19th century. It was something very different, right? He didn't think about this as kind of this bone-based kind of difference, but something that was caused by climate or something that was caused by differences in that way, right? But the important part here for me is that how this opened up a particular type of space for 19th century kind of thinking to operate, right? So that this becomes the roots of 19th century. And so this is kind of an example in which we say, well, we supposedly are kind of advancing knowledge in a particular type of way, but it actually leads to and reflects advancements within society. So advancements within society at this time, right, particularly thinking about capitalism, thinking about the new world, were based much in the US at least, on ideas of enslavement, right? And that these ideas of enslavement were also used in science, right? To then open up the space, right? To talk about reinforcing those power hierarchies, right? So not necessarily advancing for everyone, right? So when we talk about advancing or we talk about progress, we're not talking about everyone within society. We're talking about really specific kind of groups, really specific kind of thoughts, right? So this is one we probably already know, right? And so here I just say like history is never just a past, right? Case two that I wanted us to think about here, which is a different kind of spin on this. And this is to think about the 1950s UNESCO statements on race, right? That some of us are probably familiar with, right? So in the 1950s, UNESCO essentially pulled together two groups of folks. So this was in response to what had happened during World War II, and particularly what had happened in Nazi Germany and what we may call kind of Nazi racist science, right? And the question that UNESCO wanted these scientists to deal with was, what do we do with this issue of race, right? Should science even be touching this notion of race? Given what we just witnessed only a few years prior, where this was misused, I guess, in a way by science, should we be thinking about this question? And so they pull these two groups together. And the group in 1950, right, this is a group that consisted mostly of social and biological sciences. And I won't go into all of the details about this. I can maybe answer some of this during Q&A if you have some questions, but essentially what they said was that race is ideological, right? In fact, what they said is that there's two kinds of race, right? There's a social race, which they say is a myth, right? There's never really existed. And then they say there's a biological race, right? Which may exist, but we've never been able to have the biological tools to even understand kind of what that means. The social race, right, this myth race, they said, what's the problem? The problem was that we have these beliefs and these kind of bone-based differences, these gene-based differences, or the skin-based differences, phenotypical differences within people, right, which led to the Nazi racist kind of science, right? This is essentially what they're saying, right? Now, you have a second group. And the second group in 1951, so just a year later, another group convenes. And partly they convene because they are upset, right, with some of the things that come out of the 1950 statements. And the 1951 statement consisted solely of physical anthropologists and geneticists, right? And for the most part, they agreed, right, that, as I have at the top, that race, hatred, and conflict thrive on scientifically false ideas and are nourished by ignorance, right? So all of them kind of agree on this. What they don't agree on, right, is that race may be a myth, but the question of racial differences, particularly within mental health or mental traits, is not yet settled. What they essentially said is that we shouldn't close the door on science being able to kind of tease out these questions, right? So yes, we should talk about social race and why it's a myth and why it's problematic, but we should not necessarily pin down science in a way where it could not maybe address these in the future if we have the right technologies, right? If we have the right kind of tools, maybe science can kind of get at this. Now, what essentially this leads to is what sociologist Jenny Reardon writes in her book, Race to the Finish, is that far from making the exit of scientists from social debate about race, the UNESCO statements argued that society would be better off if scientists with their expert knowledge played a greater role, right? What she argues, right, and she's writing about the Human Genome Project and kind of its development through the 1990s. And what she argues is that actually, if we go back to that debate, we go back to this debate that was supposedly progress on this question, it did not close the door, but opened the door. Part of the reason why geneticists were able to ask this question again within the 1990s, Reardon argues, is because we didn't close the door when we had the chance to close the door in the 1950s, right? If in the 1950s we said this is something that's kind of off limits to science, this is something that doesn't make sense for science to be asking, this is what Alonzo Nelson calls trans-scientific, right? This is a question of science that science will constantly be asked, but not a question that they can answer, right? It can't really answer like what this means within, what does race really mean? And particularly what do these systemic kind of embedded inequalities, how they really play out? Like it's too hard, right? It doesn't really fit into the kind of the methods of the science, the kind of what science can answer. Rollins says if they would have done that, we would have had a different kind of response, right? But that's not what happened, right? Instead, what happened is these kind of moments of progress, right? Right, these moments in which we rely on particular progress, they often leave doors open to ask particular types of questions, or leave like these like doors open in the sense that, in my opinion, they reflect, right, the doors that are left open within society, right? Because society then closed the door on this kind of race question, right? If you think about what was happening, you had Nazi scientists who were being tried within the US for crimes that, as one of I remember as I was writing my dissertation, as one of the doctors who was on trial, his lawyer made an argument that my client is on trial for things that are happening right down the street in US prisons right now, right? That he's on trial for experimentation of a group. And yet in the United States, this is happening right up the street, right? And so in that way, you have these really interesting kind of complex ways in which we have on the one hand, these ideas of progress, these ideas of liberty. And on the other hand, as the United States is always kind of like really presented, we have this kind of really interesting way in which those things are getting undermined by the very practices that they're supposed to uphold. Case number 3. And this is actually this is the piece that you guys read. This is a piece that Dietz kind of mentioned. And this here is another kind of case, what I say, this is a potential case of thinking about how to do better science, right? To be more progressive or to progress on this question of race with science. So in 2018, the editors of Cortex, Roberto Cabela and Sergio de la Sala, wrote a very interesting piece called Taking Race Out of Neuroscience 2. So the piece was really interesting to me for a few reasons. So the first reason was that my postdoc mentor is Dorothy Roberts, who writes about race and science and has also written about taking race out of human genetics, right? So she has a piece with some colleagues in science where they have a piece where they say we should take race out of genetics, right? And we don't, in some ways, okay, some of my work does not necessarily match this idea of kind of what taking race out means, right? And I'll talk about why. So that was one interesting piece because they're using that piece to kind of open up the space. And then the other piece is that in this article, Cabela and de la Sala argue that there should be a radical ban of the term race in all sciences, including the neurosciences, right? And so essentially what they were saying is that you should take race out, right? These are two publishers of a huge journal like Cortex, and they're saying we shouldn't print this term race, right? We shouldn't use this term race, right? And for me, so this took me back to kind of some of my training as a graduate student. So one of my mentors is Troy Duster, who's now professor emeritus at sociology and kind of known as like the grandfather of race and science, right? He wrote a book in like early 1990s, The Backdoor to Eugenics, which ends up being like one of these books that was really prophetic in the sense of saying like, we're going to come back to these kind of notions of race and genetics, and we're going to be talking about race and genetics in ways that are problematic. And everyone told him during the 90s, we're going to close the door on race. Like this is going to, we're going to completely stop talking about race once we see that genes have nothing to do with race. But once we saw that genes had nothing to do with race, or that we were 99.9% the same, all we did was really focus on that 0.1% difference, right? That was where much of the research was at. And this is many of the things that Duster had already said. In 2003, Duster also kind of talks about what I call the kind of tenacity of race. And partly what he says here is that purging science of race may not be practical, possible, or even desirable for some research questions, right? And what he was really getting at is you can remove race out of science, you can remove race out of research, but you can't technically remove it out of like how it actually is so embedded into the things that we do, right? So you can ask all of these questions and you can say, I can quote unquote control for race because I'm gonna use a very homogenous population. You can say, I'm not gonna actually print the term race, but he was like, that doesn't mean it won't have a racial outcome. That doesn't mean that it's not speaking to the politics of race within larger society. And that's really where I was coming from here, right? You can remove race from the journal Cortex, but that doesn't mean that we're getting at then how some of the work that may come out actually speaks to race in a good or bad way, whichever way. But it doesn't mean that it won't speak to those things. It doesn't mean that we've solved this question of race, right? In fact, it's much more of a kind of colorblind way for those of us who come out of sociology. It's really kind of a colorblind science way where it's like, because we won't talk about race, therefore we don't have to deal with race, right? But that's not actually how this works. So I want to just stop for a moment because I like to kind of define some of the terms that I use, like when I'm talking about race, because I've noticed, and particularly be giving talks to interdisciplinary audiences, is I say race and I mean something, but not everybody is on the same page about what this means, right? So in Cortex, we defined race as social political practice, a system of power that has been historically woven into and made culturally visible through the constructed interdependence between supposed obvious phenotypes of difference, for example, skin color, hair texture, and the political governance of society based on unequal interests and values. Now, if you're like my students, what the hell does that mean, right? Because this is kind of how my students are like, okay, whatever, you say so. What does that mean? So the way I teach race and the way I want, I think a better way of kind of thinking about race is to think about the characteristics of race, right? Not necessarily these neat definitions that pretty much I'm talking to, the other 5 sociologists who actually do this, right? Because they can understand that definition, but more or less thinking about what are these kind of traits of race, right? That can help us understand what does it mean when race is socially constructed, right? So I was talking with a colleague earlier, and I do this exercise all the time in my class where the first thing I ask them, so I teach classes both in sociology on like sociology of race. I also teach a class on science and race, and I teach a race on like biopolitics and race. So a lot of my classes have a lot to do with race. And I often ask them, I ask everyone in the class, I said, raise your hand if you have never heard of this term race. And of course, no one raises their hand except for you, the one little smart aleck student who will raise their hand and say, I have it. And I was like, okay, well, everybody but you. Pull out a sheet of paper and write down what race means. And you have 3 minutes. And the first thing that dawns on them is, I have no idea what this thing means. I know it because we all know it, but to write down a definition is much different, right? And it's a lesson around like how these things are, how normalized and embedded they are within our society, but it's also a lesson about how we have been teaching race, right? We tell them, hey, race is a social construct, right? All of them get that right. They'll say race is a social construct. I asked them, what is a social construct? And they're like, hell, I don't know. I just know that's the right answer. And I was like, well, yes, it is. That is the answer we tell you. But what does that mean? And so what does it mean? So one, it means that race is always already political, right? And this is not kind of the conservative liberal or the blue and red, but this is political in the sense that something is at stake, right? And that it is often carving out and making particular types of social relations within the world or within societies, right? It's more than phenotype. This is kind of my way of saying race is not biological, right? It's not biological. It definitely has something to do with biology, right? I mean, often we use biology, we use phenotype to make sense of what this thing is, but the biology itself is part of the social construction. Those biological traits can change all the time. They do change all the time, right? It changes across time and space, right? I think the greatest example of this is to look at the US Census. The US Census has been around since 1790. Every year, every 10 years, I should say, we have asked a question. That question has also been racialized from the very first time we've had it, right? In 1790, we asked a question about race, which we asked how many slaves, right? Which was literally a question about who is Black, right? And every year these terms change, right? And they change across time, right? And a good example of this is in 1940s, right? 1940s, this term comes out of nowhere on our census, and the term is Mexican, right? So all of a sudden in the 1940s, we want to know who is Mexican within the country. About 20 years later or so, and my dates may be off, it may be 30 to 50, but 20 years later or so, it goes away. And so what I use this example in my class to say, okay, look, if you were born in 1930, right, and you were what we may call today as Latinx or Latino, you would have probably identified as white. In 1940, you would have been Mexican. If you lived to 1960s, you would have been white again, right? And then if you lived longer, you may have been Latino. You yourself did not change. Nothing about you changed, nothing about your physical characteristics changed, but everything about the way in which we group people, at least within the United States, changed, right? And it meant different kind of privileges, right? Maybe, if you identified in that way, right? But it definitely meant different kind of allocations of things within society, right? And so in that way, this is an example that these things are not set in stone, right? So that they're power structures, that they produce real social, economic, and psychological implications, that they're made through our social relations, that this is relational, right? This is why I kind of have a problem with the notion of thinking about, I just gave a talk to some folks at the Congress of Neurological Surgeons, CNS, and it was a whole panel on kind of racial disparities in health. And part of my critique as being only sociologist there was to say that we need better language to talk about race in neurosurgery or race in health besides disparities, right? We should not only talk about race or marginalized statuses by talking about disparities, right? That sets us up to talk and think about these things in a very limited way, right? Like you can't really talk about what is the agency of Black people if we're talking about nothing but disparities, right? So it's ways in which it misses what race really does and how complex it really is to kind of use that language. And then the last piece, right, the piece that I drive home a lot, and this comes from sociologist Tukufu Zuberi, is that race is a social process, right? That I tell my students, it's made in the in-between, right? I'm figuring out what you are based on these racial things. You're figuring out what I am, and that's what it is. Now, I go through this kind of long kind of, thing in part because this is how we led to this conclusion in our kind of response within Cortex, that there is a scientific misunderstanding around race and particularly around the social construction of race, right? So in that piece, what we argued, right, in part, is that existing neuroscientific conversations about race, for the most part, have failed to deal with the socio-political nature of race. In these papers that we were reviewing, and then even in my interviews for my book, folks will say that race is a social construct. They have no problem saying, hey, race is a social construct, and, but again, like our students are like, but what does that mean, right? Like, what exactly does that mean? And so you miss that part. And so what we argue is that race can be used in scientific writing as an analytical tool to help confront, expose, and hopefully avert scientific racism. That you can't just like not say race and then hope that you don't do racist science, right? In fact, we can talk about how race is being used or misused. This goes back to what Duster is saying. Duster made the argument that, look, it's not that race shouldn't be used. It's should we explain how and why we're using this as a particular type of marker, as a particular type of understanding in the work that we do, right? So that's really the most you can probably do with race, right? You can't just avoid it. And neuroscientists must understand and contemplate, again, what the social construction of race really means, and that to simply call race unreal will lead to colorblind scientific racism, right? Now, as he said, this piece was really interesting because we got a reply. In fact, partly of why we got to publish this in Cortex was because we had to publish it with the reply from De La Sala and Cabela, and I'll let you guys read the reply to know whether or not they actually got it or whether or not this was a prime example of actually missing kind of the point, right? And I think I would argue they kind of missed the point, right? Because they essentially said we were wrong, right? But I'll let you guys read that, all right? Case 4, and this is kind of leading up to kind of where my research is at now. And this is case 4. And this is to think about the year 2020, right? So as the deadly COVID-19 pandemic continued to upend US society, further exacerbating existing health and social inequities, the unrelenting effects of a different kind of social disaster also received fresh scrutiny: racism. The social unrest that accentuated the summer of 2020, or what CNN reported as the year America confronted racism, or what NPR said the summer of racial reckoning, now seem underwhelming, premature, and nevermore, right? We've kind of forgotten about that very quickly. But at the time, right, the response from science is one of the more interesting avenues where I think there had been more and more, and it still continues to kind of be more and more kind of thoughts about like what to do with racism, right? So Francis Collins, then director of NIH, penned an apologetic letter in 2021 saying that to those individuals in the biomedical research enterprise who have endured damages disadvantages due to structural racism, and he uses the term structural racism. I am truly sorry. Similarly, Rita Caldwell, former director of NSF, was quoted in Nature saying, "We're in one of those cataclysmic times of change," when asked why she believed it was vital to address the entrenched nature of racism in science, right? To me, these are two big responses, right? You have the former leader of NSF and you have the current, at the time, director of NIH, both saying that structural racism is a problem that science needs to kind of think through, right? You had additional editorials in prestigious journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet Science, Cell, have also directed or urged their scientific audiences to address the latent function, or latent violence, I should say, of racism, right? What is most impressive about these publications or these calls is that each plainly noted that scientific and biomedical publics must recognize racism as systemic, structural, or embedded social inequalities. These calls also seem to suggest a need for social justice and racial equity, both within and through scientific practices. So they were not simply saying, hey, we need to figure out how to measure race better, right? It was actually kind of more of a political call of saying, what is the role of science as a whole to think about these social injustices? I mean, remember, this is started by the murder of George Floyd, right? And you have these scientists who are saying, well, what role do we play in speaking about social justice, right? So one, this is a very interesting time in which you kind of drop this facade around the idea that science is apolitical, right? And you have leaders of NSF and NIH basically saying, we actually need to be political, right? Which is a very interesting kind of point in a sense, right? That we actually need to be doing something that others may call political. Race is political, so I would say it be political, right? And so this is kind of example, as I was saying, of some of the publications, right? So through NIH, through New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, Science, Lancet, right? And at the same time, right, this is kind of coming back to this progress narrative, right? The thing I started to think about is that actually, though, at the same time, we've been here before, right? In some of the examples I said, but even to think about the debates in the 1990s around diversity in biomedical research led to exclusion of more diverse participants, right? However, this new science of what sociologist Steve Epstein says, recruitmentology, inadvertently raised concerns about the way scientific research mechanisms preserve and thus revive the very same inequities that they seek to remedy. Recent evidence suggests that the recruitment policies meant to help institutionalize diverse research samples for what we call precision medicine, which came kind of out of the Obama administration, also hindered more critical and meaningful outcomes for diversity and inclusion. Our longstanding technical practices of race-based corrections, right, meant to provide more fair and accurate assessments of health, continue to help codify racially unequal health practices. The implementation of cultural competency training has largely been seen as a misdirected attempt to address racism in biomedicine, with many researchers today calling for a brand new paradigm that would adequately deal with the structural nature of inequity in the health sciences, right? And then I mentioned this before, but former US President, or I alluded to this before, former US President Clinton's now infamous statement on the end of race declaration in the White House garden after the human genome was sequenced is another example of this. The human genome was supposed to help actualize a more equitable distribution of benefits from scientific innovation. Instead, it opened the door towards more discursive, what anthropologist Dwayne Fulwiley calls molecularization of race, right? That we end up focusing again back on race. These are all these periods where we could argue that there was technological progress and scientific progress, and that ways in which we could have moved past some of these things, but we end up finding ourselves back into this trap around race again, right? In some kind of way, these questions of race, right? These new tools, right? It tends to be kind of this idea that once these new tools come, once these new practices come, we can go back and ask those old questions again, right? Around racial differences, or even if we're not directly asking them, that we end up speaking to them in particular types of ways. Now, obviously, there's a way in which our work, once we produce it, goes out into public, and there's not much you can do, right? In the sense of like how the public will pick it up. Right. At least the idea is that there's not much we can do. The question is, what can we do? Right? What is the responsibility of scientists, researchers, once our research goes out the lab and it's maybe picked up in a negative way to kind of respond to these things, right? Is it a particular kind of thing that we need to do more of, right? Now, the project that I'm kind of, so I have kind of two projects, and the one that I'm speaking to really here comes out of the summer of 2020, right? And what I was really interested in, I'm still kind of interested in knowing is like, you know, what opportunities did this moment kind of open for us? And what are the potential hurdles for us trying to do something different, right? If we're thinking about progress, right? I kind of historicize this in a way to think about, well, within the 1960s, right? Obviously there was movements, right? Social movements all around this country. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that many of the students on these college campuses were part of these movements. And there's also plenty of evidence to suggest that we didn't necessarily have a different biological sciences in the 1980s, right? That if that was a moment for change, we didn't necessarily use that moment for change in the same way this moment for change seems to be, right? That we didn't see this in kind of a different kind of politic of science. And part of that, right, I say is not necessarily on the students who then became professors. Part of that may be some of the social structures, the socio-political structures that you face by then moving by working in the academy itself, right? By some of those types of things, right, are the questions that I'm like really answering and really wanting to think about. Like, what does it mean for us to work, you know, in an academy where, you know, so let me back up. So part of this kind of question that I'm kind of asking is, what's the relationship between what I call these kind of different social worlds of, let's say, neuroscience? What I mean by that is, what happens in the lab is only one piece, right? There's a funding piece, publication piece, which is kind of what I exampled there when you're thinking about that. There's a kind of that journal publication. There's an ethics piece, right? Kind of the public kind of side to this, right? There's all these different sides, right? And which all really impede on the work that you do within the lab, right? I mean, from the questions you ask, from the funding you get, all these things matter. So what happens though, when certain things within these other social worlds may impede on the practices that you can have within your lab? So the example that I use here is to think about when we say, many people of my ilk will say, well, scientists need to define the groups, you know, they need to do what I did, make the long definition of like, what are you talking about when you say race, right? Scientists need to do that every time that they're writing, right? And I'm like, okay, that's fair, but where? Because a scientific article, right, is usually like 5-6 pages, and most people actually don't even want the background, they just want the data, right? That is a publishing or a journalistic kind of decision we made at some point in time, that this is what scientific publications is supposed to look like, right? But to me, that also means there's a particular type of barrier that's being then put on scientists who may want to actually do that, right? So even if you wanted to do it, where do you do it? Do you go? And so like, I remember I was giving this talk and someone said, well, you publish in another journal. I was like, yeah, right, who does that, right? You don't publish in another journal because part of what you're doing while you're publishing in that journal is because of things like tenure, is because of things of like the institutional kind of limitations that are setting you in the first place, right? That's why you want to go to science and have that one-page thing, right? But that also means that there are ways in which no matter what policy you make at this institutional level, it may actually be undermined by things that are happening in other institutional levels. And I'm trying to figure out then, what are those hurdles, right? To me, those are these invisible kind of ways in which race or power structures are working that are not just like race out in our kind of like face, but that is the ways in which it limits what we can do in ways that are so built into kind of what we know. So part of this also then for me makes me want to think about, and I know I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to fast forward through some of these, to think about racism as a practice, right? And so this was another piece that came out with Dorothy Roberts in our annual review of science. And part of what we argued is that we're really thinking about in this paper around what does biosocial mean, right? So a lot of us within sociology are really trying to say, okay, look, sociologists do need to actually take the body and biologically serious, right? So how do you take the biology serious, right? And at the same time, right, not run into those old kind of problems that we had before with like determinism. And so we said that our analysis does not conclude that biological determinism is inevitable anytime the biological sciences or biotechnologies approach social problems. Instead, what we said, the problem is not the technological usage, but it's the ability to obscure ethical uncertainties and structural forces and to reconstitute problematic sociocultural assumptions that researchers rely upon uncritically to execute their research. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that instead of like looking for what Sadia Hartman may say, the spectacular, like I'm less worried about racist scientists, less worried in the sense that my research is not. I am worried in the sense that they keep producing stuff, but that's not who I'm focused on. I'm not focused on those folks with these blatant kind of like racist or sexist kind of work. I'm more interested in how racism, structural inequalities, gets codified in our everyday relied upon practices. So like one of the things I think about is like examples like the facial recognition task that we use in like neuroimaging, right? So on the one hand, I study a group of neuroscientists who think about implicit racial bias, and they say, well, you know, there's ways in which they've found particular type of biases by using this task, right? It helps them kind of understand particular types of implicit racial biases. Well, on the other hand, it raises a question about, well, we use that in like all neuroimaging. So are we capturing biases? Are we capturing the thing that we said we were out to capture? Like, what does that mean for us to use that tool, right, in our work all the time, right? And that we relied upon it to make our science, right? Now, it could be that it's still giving us a thing that we're trying to measure, but that also brings up a kind of uncertainty around, could we do something else, right? Now, there are, I think, a lot of neuroscientists now who do neuroimaging who are saying, maybe we can use other tasks to try to test this, right? That may not potentially bring in these biases that these other group of neuroscientists say are there, right? And there's other ways I think that I relied upon kind of measures or I relied upon tools may do the work of undermining kind of the more anti-racist work that we want to do. And I'll say this. So for me, this is about kind of rethinking racism. And so this comes from Ruha Benjamin, Princeton University. And Benjamin writes that racial technologies are in the business of manufacturing natures. They are amnesic, or indulging a kind of violence minimalism that allows for more and more racist violence to be less and less discernible, right? And really what I kind of take from this, or what I ask is that what happens when racism becomes imperceptible to everyday science, everyday use of technologies, or everyday life, right? This is a question sociologists ask too, right? So what happens when it's so embedded in everything that we do that there is no easy way to say this is racist or this is sexist, but this is just the normal kind of way in which we produce society, the normal kind of way we produce science. And then the real question then is that how do we then capture that, right? How do we fix that, right? How do we call that out? What does that even look like? Right. And that's what this kind of projects think about. And so that means that racism is not only an intentional or unintentional act, it can be a very normative thing, right? And because it's structurally embedded in what we do. I'm gonna skip this piece and I'm gonna skip this piece because I'm like 5 minutes into, and I'm gonna go here to kind of think what I'm thinking about. This comes from the piece around towards an anti-racist neuroscience. And so in this piece, I essentially said, well, what we maybe need to think about is anti-racism, right? And that anti-racism in itself then, or the path toward anti-racism, right, then must revolutionize the very ethical bonds of accountability between neuroscience and society. More than the neuroethics of race, right? I'm kind of critiquing neuroethics in a sense. I'm calling for a new politic, a purposeful, unyielding commitment to social justice. This new politic must pressure colleges and universities to rethink their own investment in racial capital, right? And so what I'm asking then is, it's much more than just us building a new neuroethics or ethics around race, right? Because I think ethics deals much more with this kind of moralistic kind of question and not this normative question all the time. Right. And so what does it mean for us to then kind of think about the normative question? What does it mean for us? This is a question that really came back to me that I'm still struggling and thinking through, right? What does it mean for us who don't deal with human subjects or who are not in the biological sciences to be anti-racist? Like, what does it mean for an astrophysicist department to be anti-racist? Because the other thing that we're saying here is that there's no one thing is like, you know, the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture cannot be anti-racist, and then the rest of Emory is not, right? That you can't have just like one unit that says they're anti-racist, but then you're on a campus where everything is not, right? That's not what anti-racism is. You need a buy-in from everyone, right? And so what does that mean for these other kind of groups, right? And so one thing I thought about is to rethink even where we get our materials from, right? So we're really thinking about the experiments we do in the lab. Who are our vendors? Maybe what are their politics, right? Where are they getting this from, right? I think there are ways in which we can use scientific capital to shape the world that we want, right? But it's not necessarily always just hiring in more Black people within our labs, right? I think there's ways in which we can think about this beyond, in a very intersectional way, kind of beyond kind of just race, but like how do all of these kind of structural inequalities operate? And then what are the little things that we can do within the labs to kind of fix those? I know I'm like right at 6, so I'm just gonna end kind of where I started, coming back to Du Bois, right? So Du Bois, in his lifetime, one of the interesting things with Du Bois is that he changes a lot in his lifetime. He also lives to be like 95 or so he had time to change a lot in his lifetime. But, you know, one of the things that, you know, as I'm thinking through, it's like, you know, because Du Bois was actually really a positivist, right? And one of the things he argued a lot was that he felt that science would be able to answer this race question, that if he used the best science, right, if it was statistics or whatever it be, he actually pulled a lot from the natural sciences too. If he was to use the best science, he can show people that actually these inequalities that you say are there, right, these differences that you say are there are really not really real, right? Or they affect everybody in a way, but the way you explain it is only to kind of pigeonhole a particular group. What he learned throughout his life, I think, is a lesson that we kind of learned too, is that just having the best scientific data doesn't mean that society listens to us, right? I mean, we have a really good example of that around COVID right now, where just because we had scientific evidence of saying, hey, we need to be doing these things to decrease COVID, it didn't mean that society was actually listening or politicians was actually listening. And so it's a lesson that I think Du Bois actually learned over his lifetime too, is that you're not going to be able to just give them better data in order for it to make change. That it's going to be something more, right? And so the takeaways that I had kind of with Du Bois is then also think about how our narratives then of social and scientific progress have a congruence arc, reciprocal kind of dynamics, meaning that they kind of play off of each other. The way in which we think about race within the science is a reflection of the way in which we think about race within society, right? If we're in a moment of society where we think about race, and maybe we're not in that moment anymore, but if we've been in this moment of society where we thought about race as very colorblind, it's not a surprise that much of science has said, let's not deal with race as a way to kind of deal with race, because that's actually what society is saying, right? It's not like a very different way in which scientists are thinking about this. They're actually reflecting what society does, right? So think about how race operates in multiple ways and then through neuroscience, and that there's really no way to kind of separate these ideas from science and society. And that to also think about new ways, and this is really the summary of what I'm kind of saying here, and this kind of neuroscience approach to racism have been inadequate, is also to push us to kind of think beyond kind of like ideas like DEI. As much as I appreciate DEI and I'm on DEI boards, I don't think we do DEI very well. In fact, we tend to just do the diversity part. And we bring in folks and then we say, solve the problem, right? And that folks coming in is kind of how you're supposed to solve the problem. And that's not enough. Right. And so we need to rethink our commitments to DEI in a very different kind of way. And that's something else I think that comes out of these kind of like ideas of kind of progress, right? Just having DEI is not necessarily the progress that we need. We really need to kind of push this in a different way. And I have another slide, but I'm gonna stop there because it's 5 o'clock and we didn't even have time to ask questions. So thank you.
I'm a graduate student in the neuroscience program here, and so I was kind of wondering, at Emory specifically, I would say most of our neuroscience labs are non-human, whether that be like rodents or stem cell organoids or non-human primates or whatever. And so I'm kind of wondering if you think there are any like action items or pitfalls in non-human neuroscience with the science itself that we can use to be anti-racist, or is it more like existing within the framework of neuroscience?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I mean, in part, it's an empirical question that I'm trying to figure out as well, right? That is it that, so I could say, first of all, that I'm not saying everyone needs to start studying race. That's absolutely not. We don't need new racial science. Like everyone shouldn't just start adding in race into their work to be anti-racist either. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm actually trying to force us to think about what are ways in which we deal with systemic inequalities that go beyond just our DEI objects or just adding people into labs. Like what are the other ways in which this looks like? So for example, one of them was like, okay, can we think about the materials within our labs? Can we think about the politics in that way? I mean, there are great examples in which there are like from like a almost DEI perspective of like how we mentor the folks that are in our lab, who gets into our lab, what does that look like? Partly, I think the question that we're dealing with is a question that we've wrestled with a while, and that is what does productivity look like in the academy? And part of the problem is that productivity for us has always been publications, grants, tenure. That's progress, right? That's productivity. We learned during COVID, right, that we had a lot of conversations around, well, people who have to take care of their families and mostly women will fall behind their male colleagues, right, who have more time to kind of do this work. Well, absolutely, that's true. But the problem is that we didn't talk about what was the real problem. The real problem was that why is our productivity structured in a way in which men will actually be able to continue to do their work if something like this happens, right? To me, that is a structural question, right? That I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to get much more at these structural issues that will lead to the reproduction of inequality generally, but also using race as the exemplar to kind of get at that. But what are those things, right, that we rely upon? So one of them is the structure that we think about within the university. I'm not saying that the university is going to change tomorrow. Hell, I don't even know if there's a such thing as an anti-racist university, right? I don't even know what that would look like. Not sure you can quite do that because it would call, to me, that's a different kind of politic, right? Like I remember when I was at my former university, University of Louisville, this question was asked. We were supposed to, at the time, the president said we wanted to be the premier anti-racist university within the country. I don't know what premier means. I don't know what it means to be an anti-racist university. But I also knew there were certain things that were required of anti-racism that can't happen, right? Like getting rid of the police. You're not going to be able to do that. It's not going to happen. Not at a state school anyway, right? Paying adjuncts a fair wage, which are mostly people of color, women, poor folks. Not going to happen, right? We thrive off of that. That is how the structure is set up. Now, there's problems why that was set up that way, in decrease in funding from states, decrease in funding. It's a lot of reasons why that is the thing, but that is the thing, right? And so I'm not sure if that's the case, right? So to kind of come back to your question, I think in part this is an empirical question I'm trying to get at of like, what should we be doing? And partly in my research, I'm also asking folks like you and others who are in that position of also, what do you want neuroscience to look like? If we are to get at these things, what should neuroscience look like in the future? Same thing I ask my students. What should an anti-racist campus look like, right? And it's hard because it requires a different kind of thinking. Yes.
I think you answered some of them. So I'm a retired professor from here, psychology and neuroscience. Speaking of the neuroscience program, I was a group of 4 people who traveled around the country in a little committee that designed our current neuroscience program. And I hear this about structural racism. Now, I know structural racism, you talk about insurance companies. And when you talk about loans for housing. But I don't know what structural racism means in neuroscience. And you very adroitly brought up a major problem, which is this. This is a Research 1 university. I mean, it's very proud to be a research R1 university. There used to be only 50 of them in the United States. I think there are more now. And we're approaching, I think, $1 trillion a year in research grants, virtually all from the biomedical side of campus. And the way it is now, someone in biomedical, let's say in neuroscience, goes to graduate school, spends 4-7 years in neuroscience, gets out with her PhD, goes out, doesn't get a job, goes out, gets a postdoc, because that's now expected. Maybe they find a job after their postdoc. Maybe they go to a second postdoc. So they're orbiting, waiting for a job to open up somewhere. A job opens up. They then send in their grant, their first grant, an R01 to NIH, where you're not replying to a specific call for projects. You're saying, I think this is a great thing to do. The average age right now for getting an R01, your first R01, is 41. So you've put in all that time. Now, you have graduate students apply, and some of them are interested in your lab. You've got a gun held to your head, which is produce results to get your grant, to produce more results, all right? And this is even more at even more prestigious universities than Emory. For instance, there's some medical schools where you need to have a publication in Nature and a publication in Science if you're going to get tenure. So the result is that they're going to look for their graduate students at people who have unbelievable credentials. And that's going to have a great impact on admitting students of color.
Yeah, so a few things I'll say. So So one way I think we can tackle this by this kind of question around kind of diversity, right? And then this is kind of one of the problems where diversity can actually make kind of an impact, right? So in part, what you explained to me, that system, right, does fit into this larger system of what I would say systemic racism. Now, as sociologists, we use these terms very differently. Systemic, structural, all these things mean something very different to us.
You use terms, I don't know what they mean.
Yeah, some of them you mean very different. Yeah, but this is the same with me reading neuroscience. I read a lot of neuroscience, I don't know what the hell that means, right? And I have to figure it out. So like, this is the same thing, right? So like, partly is though, I think what you're getting at is there are structural inequalities, right? There's structural constraints, right? In the way in which we think about, and actually, as you're pointing out, is that the bar is getting higher and higher, right? I've seen somebody jokingly say on Twitter a few years back, I don't know, I guess the site formerly known as Twitter, a few years ago, that, you know, at some point they were reading applicants who were coming in PhD departments, like at some point you're gonna need a PhD to get a PhD. Like, this is insane. Like these people are so much more qualified than you were 20 years ago to even get into programs, right? So I think, as your point, the bar is getting higher, there's more constraints, there's larger kind of social pressures that are happening. All of that is true across the board, right? And you're absolutely right that you're constrained in a way of like saying, well, you know, that means that once you get a grant, you need to produce and you need to do these things, right? But to me, that means we need to rethink what this structure is. The other point, though, this question has come up a lot to me, even as a graduate student. I remember being I was at UCSF as a graduate student, and it came up to me where they said, you know, thinking about this question of diversity, right? And UCSF, you know, which was competing with folks from going to Berkeley or Stanford, they're saying like, you know, we have a hard time bringing in qualified, diverse applicants. But my question was, what are we gonna do about that, right? Because Oakland's right there. And we're not doing anything within these neighborhoods to then get people prepared. If it's a lack of Black students, what then is the responsibility of these places like Emory or other places? Yes, because you need that if you're going to actually then have the diverse pathways of which we're talking about, right? Because that's part of the constraint, right? Is that we basically said we can't do anything about it, which is actually not true either, because a bunch of my friends who all came from Harvard, all were Black women. And I was like, they seem to be doing just fine. So it's not that you can't get it, right? It's that you have to invest in a particular type of way. And partly is that at the institutional level, we want quick results. Long-term investments is hard to sell. We know that. Like, it's hard to sell a long-term investment with someone who wants like immediate results. Everything we do is about immediate results. Yes.
So, a couple of things. One comment, maybe a question. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
One of the things that is baked into the system is this expectation or understanding that underprepared and underprivileged are entangled with race or racial identity, right? So the idea that, you know, we went through all this and then, oh, but how are we going to get the Black people involved because we're looking for quality?
Yeah.
And so the fact that the quality might be at odds is really a little bit problematic and part of the problem already.
Agreed.
So we have to be careful that even some of the insidious ways that we think about what that progress looks like already has some of the baggage from years beyond. So I wanted to say that, and then also to ask about your perspective, and this one's more of a feeling, thinking question. I think you're
like
wrapping
this.
them up. Linked struggles, right? If race is already big, amorphous, and difficult to figure out, do we link sexism too? Or do we just leave that one alone? Because they're intersecting, right? And the dynamics, we might learn lessons from one that could help in the other. But what do you think? Is that an approach you would be, or like just keep it nice and circumspect since your area is already messy, or do we throw on?
We throw it all in.
We throw it on there?
There's no way.
Let's go.
There's no way you can disentangle all of those things, right? I mean, partly because I'm a sociologist and I'm on that Marxist side, because apparently as a sociologist, you're either Marxist or not Marxist. So I'm kind of more on that Marxist side on that sense, right? And then also, I mean, much of the lessons I learned about even how to critique science comes from feminist science, right? So I mean, I'm borrowing lessons on how to do that. I'm borrowing lessons from Black studies on how to approach this, right? I'm very interdisciplinary in that way. And I mean, I don't think there is a way in which we can say, hey, we're going to deal with the race problem, and then we're going to come back and deal with this like class and, you know, ability problem. That doesn't even make sense, because one, then we're also saying that in some kind of way that, let's say, Black people are not also gendered or have a bit like, because there are Black people that fit in those other categories as well, right? And so no, I think you have to like attack them at once. Now, what I do think what ends up happening is that's very daunting. I mean, just attacking one is very daunting, but just attacking all of them, you're like, I mean, it's almost kind of a paralyzing thing where folks are like, well, it's nothing that we can really do, right? But you have to do something. In fact, I think about, I literally just said this to, I think, somebody in the meetings, but like, I think about, you know, what James Baldwin was getting interviewed in the 1950s, and someone asked him in 1960s, and he was asked, what does he think the future of race